So much thirst. Very horny people. So that was good. That's a big difference. Leigh Bardugo is an American author of fantasy novels. She has written a big long series of YA fantasy and one adult fantasy novel. Until recently, I hadn't heard of her Shadow and Bone trilogy, which is where she began, but I had heard of Six of Crows, which is a follow-up to that trilogy / spin-off thing. Six of Crows is a pretty big deal in the fantasy world, and I've been thinking about reading it for years. Then came the Netflix show. The Netflix adaptation of Shadow and Bone burst onto the scene, and Jess and I watched it pretty quickly, and we really enjoyed it, and from there we thought, well, let's pick up some of her books, let's see what all the fuss is about, and it gives me a reason to finally read Six of Crows. Jess started reading them from the beginning with Shadow and Bone, which is the first of a trilogy, followed by the Six of Crows duology. I decided to start with her adult fantasy novel Ninth House, which is basically Donna Tartt's The Secret History, but with dark magic. And I have not finished this book at the time of recording. I am 163 pages in, and I'm finding it okay. I also didn't love The Secret History, which is a thing that you don't tend to admit to, but I think I just don't really like academia as a setting, and especially dark academia. I don't know, this is occult and strange and dark and twisted, and I really hoped I would enjoy it, and Joe Hill liked it, and I like Joe Hill, but I don't know, maybe I'll finish it one day. But this video is not about Ninth House, it's about Shadow and Bone, and I have just read Shadow and Bone, and I'm going to compare it to the TV show, which, as I said, I really enjoyed. When we started watching the Shadow and Bone Netflix adaptation, we didn't know anything about it. We just dove in, we'd heard good things, and we started. Episode 1 was full of really cringe and awkward exposition that made my toes curl, and I had my teeth gritted throughout the entire thing. From episode 2 until the end, it was great. It literally got better and better as it went, it got more comfortable in its own skin, and it was absolutely stunning. The Shadow and Bone adaptation is an audio-visual delight. It has stunning music, the soundtrack is gorgeous, and the lighting and set design, costume design, color palette, everything about the visuals and aesthetics is delicious. It looks expensive, and they've clearly done everything right when it comes to using their budget correctly to make something that looks and sounds beautiful. It really is a spectacle for the eyes and the ears. So that's great. If you don't know what Shadow and Bone is, I will quickly explain that it is a trilogy of books. It was Leigh Bardugo's debut thing. It's set in a pre-revolution Russia-inspired fantasy world. So it's entirely fantasy, but it's very Tsarist Russia. So it has rifles and bear skins and cold things and names that sound vaguely Russian and big beautiful palaces and horses and carriages, etc. So it has the aesthetics and the mood and tone of a 18th, 19th century Russia. The world that it's set in is called Ravka. North of Ravka is a place called Fjärda, which is kind of Viking, Scandinavia inspired, and then south of Ravka is a place called Shuhan, which is very China inspired. When the adaptation begins, we are following the journey of an orphan girl called Alina Starkov, and Alina is like, I don't know, 18, 20 years old. She grew up in an orphanage that was run by this duke who was a wealthy patron and a war hero, I think, and he just takes in war orphans. Doesn't really pay them much mind, just kind of gives them a roof because he feels like he should do something for his community, and that's what he chooses to do. She grew up with this boy called Mal, both of them are orphans, and they were thick as thieves growing up, and now, when the show begins, they are soldiers. They are traveling somewhere. You don't really get a lot of context for it, despite how much exposition the show throws at you, but they are traveling towards this big black void that tore their country in half. So you've got Ravka and West Ravka. It's split by this thing called the Shadow Fold, which is this enormous black void filled with deadly monsters. And if you want to travel from Ravka to West Ravka, you got to travel through the fold on this cool land ship thing. I wasn't sure when the show started why they were soldiers now, or why they were going where they were going, what for. Are they at war? It's not entirely clear. I wasn't sure. I just went with it. While they're in the Shadow Fold, Alina blows up into white light, and then it turns out that she might be this special magic person. In the world of the Grecia verse, there are these people called the Grisha or Grecia, and they are kind of like the mutants in X-Men. Some people are born with Grecia powers, and those powers are magical, and there are kind of different types of Grecia. There are ones that can manipulate fire, ones that can manipulate water, ones that can manipulate air and storms and things, and they're all given names that sound vaguely Russian-ish. And then there's one guy called the Darkling, and the Darkling is a very, very powerful Grecia who kind of lords over all of the rest of them and works for the king. So when Alina bursts into white light in the fold and comes out all bruised but alive, she gets carted off to the palace, to the Darkling, or by the Darkling, with the Darkling, to figure out what the hell she is, if she is a powerful instrument that the country can use. And Mal just kind of gets left behind. That's your setup. Like a lot of people watching the show, I was thrown in the deep end and I just went, okay, sure, right, this is what's going on. The Shadow and Bone book does, unsurprisingly, a much better job of establishing what the hell is going on. I must say that the show is a fantastic adaptation of the story of the book. There are minor differences all the way through, but if you just want the story and you want a visual spectacle, the show really is an astonishing adaptation. But the book does offer, at the beginning, a lot more context as to what's going on. Before they get into the Shadow Fold, you do find out kind of why they are there in the first place, and they're basically traveling through the Fold for some experience and investigation. The Fold is a mystery, and they're trying to learn more about it, and they're trying to map it in a bit more detail, and Alina is a cartographer. And so you get a little bit more background detail about why she and Mal are doing what they're doing and what's going on and if there is a war, etc, etc. So, as you would expect from a book, you get a little bit more of the lore and the background and the details. Great. Now this is YA, and YA fantasy comes with a few irritating caveats, at least for me as an adult reader. And one is protagonists that act like moody and sassy teenagers. And I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that this book only suffers from that in one area. Pretty much every bit of dialogue in this book is not cringe. These characters talk like adults, they behave and interact with each other like adults, except for Alina herself. Now the book is written in the first person, as a lot of YA fantasy books are, because you want to feel as an audience like you are attached to the character as closely as possible. She is, in effect, an audience surrogate to a point. That usually means that this protagonist will be a little bit dull and a little bit uninteresting. Alina is a worse offender than that, because she is sassy, and she comes across as a kind of anime isekai protagonist. She talks like a person from our world, aged 17, 18, who has been thrown into this world. Like, she wasn't born and raised in Ravka, she was born and raised in California, and she suddenly ended up in this world in this isekai kind of a manner. That's how it feels, because she talks with so much frustrating sass and gloom and moodiness. She sounds like a teenager from our world, but the other people her age don't. Male, female, whatever, they just don't talk like this. She's annoying as shit. In the show, her friend Mal is boring. And in the book, Mal gets a little bit less face time, and I was really relieved because he's boring in both. You can't fault the actors who play Alina and Mal. They captured the essence of these characters. In the show, Alina is irritating and annoying, and Mal is boring. So it captured their characters pretty well. But Alina and Mal are not the only characters, and pretty much everyone and everything else is really entertaining, and the dialogue between other characters is really snappy and engaging. Mild spoilers for a bit later in the show/book. Around the, I don't know, halfway point in the book/show, Alina and the Darkling briefly have a romantic fling. In the book, it is really okay. They have a kiss, there's some nuzzling that goes on, and she collapses on her bed all happy and butterflies in her stomach. Oh, I kissed the Darkling, oh. And that's it. In the show, she is thirsty as fuck. Like, I was so all in on this. The actor, I guess, like the actor playing the Darkling is Ben Barnes, and Ben Barnes is sexy. We all thirst after Ben Barnes. He's gorgeous. He was Dorian Gray, and she knows it, and she really goes in. Like, she is drooling for him. She is not holding back. Like, I can't even tell if it's acting, because she's as thirsty for him as I would be in her position. There is so much horniness in the show. Their kisses are so intense. They are ravenous for each other, her especially. Like, I cannot overstate how thirsty she is. In the book, it's like, oh, I kissed the Darkling, tee-hee-hee. In the show, it's like, Jesus Christ, man. They really, really are going for it. And I loved every second of it. It was so good. So much thirst. Very horny people. That was a lot of fun. In the book is a lot more tame. Not that in the show it's like nudity and raunchy and pornographic. It's just really loud and thirsty. So that was good. That's a big difference. Another difference that I think really makes the book worth reading for fans of the show is, as I said, you get a lot more lore and background stuff. And in one aspect, that includes the Grecia themselves, because the Grecia are kind of categorized. It mentions in the book the different relationships that nations have with their Grecia. Grecia are everywhere. They are, as I say, kind of mutants who are just born with these specific powers, and they get tested as children to find out if they're Grecia. In Ravka, there's a lot of prejudice towards them, there's a lot of fear, but some of them, you know, they get recruited into the military, they work for the king, they can have a really good life. You know, to a point, they're still kind of tools and weapons, I guess, but they are respected in certain aspects and certain ways. But if you go to the north, the northern country, I've forgotten what it's called, Fjorden? I think it's called Fjorden. There, they are burned at the stake. They are witches, and they are chased out, and they are burned, and they are endangered. And then in the Shuhan area of the south, they're experimented on to find out what makes them tick exactly. You get those little detailed insights, and it really helps with the world building. I do think the world building in this is spectacular. I did a video a few weeks ago on Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which I thought was an exercise in terrible world building. It is not how you do world building in fantasy, YA or not. The world building in Shadow and Bone is much, much better. And in the book, it is better than in the show. The show doesn't have time to go into these little details about the Grecia and how they are treated. In the show, you can see the different types of Grecia within the military based on the clothes that they wear, and you see their powers being used on the battlefield. But in the book, you get the names of those types, and you get even how they are used tactically. There's a bit that describes how the ones who control the water and the ones that control the storms, they're called squallers, I think, and wave makers, I think that's what they're called. They're often paired together. So they go out into battle, and you'll get two of those put together because they make a good team. So you get some of the tactical details about how their powers work out in the world and on the field as soldiers, and I thought that was a really nice detail. So these extra little bits of lore and background detail and the mechanics of the world really help flesh it out and make it definitely worth reading the book alongside watching the show. A big difference between the show and the book, however, is the fact that the show also includes the characters from Six of Crows. I haven't read this yet, but as far as I know from Jess, the way she explained it is that Six of Crows is effectively a sequel to the events of the Shadow and Bone TV show. The crows here are introduced as a separate thing. You can read Six of Crows by itself without having read Shadow and Bone. The TV show takes the opportunity to use its time and build itself up a little bit as a prequel to this. I don't know if Leigh Bardugo had a hand in writing the show, I probably should look that up, but you can kind of treat what the characters in this book do as a prequel to this. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. The show is not these two books combined. Hello, sorry, hi. The show is not these two books combined. It is this book plus a prequel to this book which was written for the show. So it's not the same as this. So I guess you could watch the show, get introduced to the crows, but I don't think in the books they're called the crows, I think they're called the dregs. Yeah, the dregs. Am I getting that wrong? Fuck it, I'm a professional. So you can watch the show, get introduced to those characters, especially Jesper is best boy, and then read this. But again, I haven't actually done that yet. So if the show had been just this, just Alina's story, which it isn't, it would have been really short. In fact, if they'd done that, it probably would have been best to make it a film trilogy like The Hunger Games. This would be one film, and then there'd be 2 more films. But instead, it's a 8-episode Netflix series, and they integrate the Six of Crows characters into it to flesh out the world, and it works spectacularly. Absolutely loved it. They are great characters, they're the best characters in it, and I think this is probably the reason why people generally love Six of Crows a lot more than they love Shadow and Bone, because the characters in Six of Crows are fantastic. But I haven't read the book yet. I only know they're fantastic from watching them in the show. One thing that the show also does that I think it handled a little bit better is there is something that happens right towards the end in kind of the final act of the show and book that is done much better in the show because it's made a lot more visually visceral and it's more clearly a kind of rape allegory. I won't go into what it is because spoilers, but in the book it's pretty tame. In the show, it's a lot more visceral. It isn't sexual assault, by the way. Trigger warning, no, there is no sexual assault. There is something that is allegorical of sexual assault. Think of it as similar to if you've seen the Maleficent film, when the king tears Maleficent's wings off. That is a rape allegory. Same thing. And it's done much better in the show, and I have to wonder if Leigh Bardugo asked for it to be twisted and changed, like that was something maybe she regretted. I don't know, I'm not sure. It just kind of feels like maybe that's the case. But the show does that a lot better, and it certainly makes it stick with you, and it hits a lot harder. So that was an improvement, I think, that the show did over the book. So if you're a fan of the books, the show is worth watching because of, as I said, how much of an audio-visual delight that it is. It is so gorgeously choreographed, the set design and lighting is spectacular, and the soundtrack is heavenly. If you're a fan of the show and you haven't read the books, yes, I think the first book is worth it. It's worth it because it's only 300 pages. I read it in 3 days. It is well written. Like, this was a debut novel. It is YA fantasy. I'm very skeptical about that, and yet I thought it was really, really well done. The world building is excellent. It stretches everything out in a satisfying manner. The only downsides are that Alina is really annoying, Mal is really boring, and the thirst is dialed down a little bit. But as I said, the lore and the world building is expanded, and that is really satisfying. Once I'm done with the whole trilogy, I will probably make a video on it. I will also probably make a video on Six of Crows. I am pretty invested in all of this now. If I ever finish Ninth House, I'll do a video on that as well. And maybe an article on all of it, discussing all of Leigh Bardugo's works, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, thanks for watching. Join our Patreon, please. I promise I'll make it worth your while, with content, just content, and subscribe for books.